going to attempt to give you guys a summary of these 6 sections that I had to read because, it was pretty intense going across the Atlantic Ocean into Britain, Germany, Soviet Union, and I believe those were and then coming back to the United States. But here we go. George Wallace was in England. He was a product of a local design school, and he was highly regarded for his paintings as well as his influence in the local community. He was pardon me for scratching my nose, but he was originally affiliated with the Government School of Design. That was a bureaucratic institution in Britain. However, he did kind of, depart. He left them in order to start his own school, which is what we all should be doing, starting our own schools, our own galleries, and our own places to do art for art's sake. He individualized and customized his teaching based on the location of the school and also the needs of the local industry. So basically what he was doing was when he built his school and he conceived it, he took a needs-based assessment to see what the local areas needed. And when he took that needs assessment, he found that he needed to design his lessons to equip his students to do the basic general principles rather than having the students copy a form that, were the same strategies from bureaucratic schools. His techniques were used for hundreds of years. It sparked such an expression of the fact that his artistic identity and his professional experience as an artist were helped him make his teaching the students essential. He designed his own courses for advanced students while at the same time making sure that they learned, that the students that weren't as advanced learned the same type of techniques. But of course, he did more for those advanced students. He called himself an artist educator long before the term teaching artist came to be. And his students were more likely effectively prepared for professional work because they had worked on their own original designs and experienced the creative designer the creative process as a designer. He ran into many roadblocks though, because when you're trying to fund a school, you need government funding or whatever. And because of the fact that the government funding wasn't going to come through, he ended up having to close the school. He was very historically significant to the teaching artist community because he elaborated his ideas and, he was a major contributor to our landscape. The next movement was in England in the 1860s, and then it kind of moved to the United States in the early 20th century. Pardon my nose. And that was called the Arts and Crafts movement. The Arts and Crafts movement was a philosophy that originated in England and then moved across the water. Arthur Wesley Dow was one of the notable teaching artists that was very influential in the movement. Basically, they sought to have better craftsmanship and apply, more artistic processes to the traditional handicrafts made in commercial areas. So with that being said, the movement's fear, the people that, adhered to the movement, they feared that the growth of industry would lead to the eradication of handicrafts. So basically saying that they feared that because of the growth in population, because of the growth in the industry, because industry was growing, that you wouldn't have time to do handicrafts. So they made, they championed traditional artisanship, so people using their hands in order to make the stuff, carving, painting, sculpting, all of that. They actually wanted to breathe new life into what had become so sterile. So people needed to learn what the fabrics were, what the textiles were, what the threads meant, furniture and wallpaper, get away from just that and move on to something grander and bigger. It was such a political movement because it sought to create well-made products as opposed to and not return and, return to, the beauty of art. William Morris, he was one of the more influential people of the movement. He was the person that came up with the Morris and Faulkner School, and they favored handicraft products. They worked with nature, so get out there in the woods and cut your own wood to make your own paper, and so on and so forth. Get your own, handicraft your metal to make the industry. Also, they went into tapestries and glasswork, stained glass, and that type of thing. And it was a very radical shift from what everybody was used to. But he was trying to revive the old guild methods from the medieval area. So with that being said, when he was trying to, he wanted people to become masters. So if you're a painter, he wanted you to be a master painter. If you're a sculptor, he wanted you to be a master sculptor and know all of the techniques entailed to make the art great. So he romanticized this. The Romanticism period came and it gained a lot of strength in the Industrial Revolution. And as part of that, they were looking back to that Middle Age and medieval period of when all of the artists did things that were great and that were withstood the test of time. And they made things that were simple and beautiful, but all the simple and beautiful stuff was expensive and it required more time and more resources. So even though, that was all going on, we still had an emergence of the British schools and colleges and later things coming across the border to the United States. So with the declining influence, it began in Bauhaus. Bauhaus came in, and Bauhaus was kind of, came in kind of swift and kind of quick, and they used some of the same techniques of the arts and craft movement, but basically, they were more industrial driven. They were more influential. It was one of the most influential art schools created, but it was more industrial driven. They had people that were artists, architects, designers, and performers in Germany, and they persisted. They were a culture that persisted. Out of that era came schools like the Black Mountain College, which was a structure for art education in the United States. And a lot of the philosophies came from Walter Gropius, who was one of the primary teachers of the Bauhaus School. He was referred to as one of the more important artist teachers or teaching artists in the history of art education ever, because he was that important. Elkins, another artist, considered him the most important influence on contemporary art instruction. His trainings as a professional architect guided and shaped the design of the Bauhaus School, because the curriculum molded the modern art school. Because of his curriculum, that's why we have a modern art school. He embraced new technologies. He overcame the division between arts and crafts, as well as the gross schisms between art and industry. And he was a very in-tuned teaching artist that used many of his artistic skills to bridge the divides between the new and the old methods, which was vitally important to the industry because you don't want it to die off. He sought to create an environment that prepared students to utilize the technologies of the future. So here we go with the being able to have first year students do a body of art. Like when you take an art class for the first time when you're in college, you go through, first year foundation courses. You have to take 2D and 3D and 2D design, 3D design, color theory. You have to take drawing, that type of thing. His school made the foundation for those courses to be done. He pushed boundaries, and he sought to make sure that he developed a nexus of thinkers, of original thinkers that would push it. So he hired additional teaching artists. It wasn't him. Gropius wasn't the only one that taught. I mean, he went and he got people like Marcel Breuer and Siegfried Giedion, who eventually went to Harvard to teach. He went and got Joseph Albers, who went to Yale, Mies van der Rohe, who went to the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago, and also Gioris Kepis, who went to the MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And he also sought to make a reemergence of this type of school in Chicago at IIT, which is the Institute of Technology, Illinois Institute of Technology and Design. So all of this had such a profound influence on America in the post-war society that he was a person that actually reunited arts and crafts, the University of Talents, and the human purpose of art and design, to make sure that students not only studied all of the art student disciplines, but also did work in mathematics and science and other fields, which was majorly important because you want to have a well-rounded student. So we move forward to Russia, where the Vykutsanist, which is the acronym for High Art and Technical Studio, comes into play in the 1920s to 1930s. With that being said, it was a school in the Soviet Union that was state-sponsored. Again, we're working with bureaucracy. So for 10 years, the school existed, and because it wouldn't conform to the social norms, and because they wouldn't conform to the political pressures of the bureaucracy, they ended up having to close. This was probably another influential school because it was very similar to Bauhaus in the sense of they wanted to make sure that everybody was a master of their craft. They wanted to make sure that painters knew how to paint effectively in all mediums and, utilize all different types of things. So they were very, very influential. Everybody looked to them. But again, because of political pressure, they had to close. But the difference between Bauhaus and Vykutsanist was that they were more rigorous in theory and attempted to align to the industrial practices. Vykutsanist was a site of an explosion of practical and theoretical innovation across all disciplines. So you had so many things bursting at the seams coming from this. Rodchenko was one of the artists that was hired to work at the school, and he was a constructivism person and an ardent supporter of Bolshevik revolution. And he was key in advancing their social construct going forward. Malevich was a geometric-based painter, and he blurred the lines between his artistic activities and teachings. And while it was a short-lived program, it was a place where teaching artists could thrive and be happy and do things and experiment and have the freedom to do so. It was a low priority for the Soviet Union for obvious reasons because of political pressure, but it was a place that, it was definitely a place where artists could call home. Now we come to America, good old USA, and the priorities of offering art shifted from World War I to World War II. Prior to World War I in the United States, it was about artistic training. It was about industrial training, knowing how to do art because you wanted to build something or you wanted to put a mural on a building for it to look good. But after 1920, the industrial emphasis faded away. And arts got taught because of cultural practices, because of creativity, because of, leisure or self-expression. And so basically, that's why, there's been so many highs and lows with teaching art in schools, because the priorities shift with the supply and demand of a population. So if a country is poor, arts will be used for technological purposes, for architecture, for that type of thing. But if the population is rich at the time, if we're going through an economic upturn, then we can teach art for art's sake and everybody's okay with it. In the 1800s, Benjamin Franklin was an early advocate for art, but it wasn't introduced into public schools until the early part of the 19th century. And before 1970, art art education consisted as an extra frill taught by a volunteer. It wasn't until the late part of the 1860s that it was actually introduced into schools in major cities. After 1870, it became a curricular subject in most major cities, and drawing was in public schools in Massachusetts, where it was viewed as contributing to the industry. Again, it was utilized to help build. It wasn't utilized for freedom for expression. And it was also used for future industrial workers. At the beginning of the period, it was taught by principal teachers. It was taught by, let's say, a math teacher. A math teacher would teach you art. It wasn't taught by a specialist or an artist that was teaching art. It didn't change until later in the 20th century. There was a radical shift and paradigms were challenged by progressive educational theory. And there was a growth and an increase in American presence in world politics after World War I. And then there were early teachers that came and decided to push the envelope forward. Florence Kane and Victor D'Amico were the two teachers that really based their curriculums on the children being recognized for their artistic talent and not just for their smarts of knowing the mathematical computations. So they drew upon modernist principles in the visual arts. Kane actually advocated for drawing and imagination with the non-dominant hand, and they both stressed that creativity as central in their teaching and demonstrated the importance of art-based knowledge in ways that greatly influence their teaching art and teaching artist practices. So, with all that being said, the travel from the mid-19th century or 1800s to the 20th century, there was a lot going on in the teaching artist community. There were a lot of political pressures to just bow down and not do. But those teaching artists actually pushed their programs through, and that's why we are where we are, taking this course called Teaching Artist.